Here we are again, and we are talking about the fact that Adam and Eve, who are our ancestors, okay, they were the first male and female, the first spirit in man in earthly bodies, given dominion and rulership on the earth over all God's creation. They were given responsibility, okay? Now, in that responsibility, they were to be in enhancing creation and managing creation. You know the difference between a garden and the woods or forest, okay? One is taken care of, one is manicured, one is looked after and cared for, okay? Where things grow wild, you call that the forest. But to have a garden is that which is cared for, tilled, and managed, okay, and nourished, okay? So that's what we're supposed to be doing with all of creation. Now, during that whole time, too, God said, our Father, our Heavenly Father said to Adam and Eve, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil, okay? But they had the tree of life, and they were given access to everything else. All the things that were in the Garden of Eden were given to them. It was accessible. But one thing, and that's what choice comes in. The choice was, but do not eat of the knowledge of good and evil. You now have the knowledge of God. Well, they probably didn't understand that, but they had the knowledge of God. They were walking with God. God would come with them, and they could in the evening and fellowship with them. And so they were obtaining a relationship with God, and they were receiving the knowledge of God. And God was sharing God's self with them, all right? But they chose the knowledge of good and evil. Good and evil is what this world can offer, all right? You're either good or evil, all right? Neither is comparable to godly, all right? So they gave up godly to be either good or evil. That's why a lot of good people are not going to be in the presence of God for eternity, because good is not godly enough, or good enough, as we would say, not godly enough. You can be a good person, but a good person is not a godly person. A lot of people don't know that, okay? And they find themselves fellowshipping with people who have the same mind and belief that they do. I'm a good person, and we good people, we come together and we look at those people who are evil and we put them down. We don't want to be nothing like them. So therefore we consider ourselves better than evil people. But if you compare yourself with godly or godliness, there's no comparison, okay? Godliness is much greater than good. And this is what they chose. They chose to be either good and evil rather than be godly. All right, so they fell from the grace of God. In other words, they no longer could be in the presence of God, because unless you are holy, unless you are sacred, unless you are sanctified, okay, you are set apart for God's purpose, which makes you sacred, which makes you special, unique, divine relationship. You have to be of divine spirit. You have to be consecrated. You have to be sanctified. You have to be pure of heart. They no longer had that. So therefore, they had to leave the presence of God. They were kicked out of the garden. And then they were put out into the world, which was not at that time under God's protection, because they lost their authority and the dominion and rulership that they had over creation when they went outside of the garden. They're no longer operating in God's presence. They were no longer operating under God's authority. and the delegated authority that he gave to them. So therefore, they were no longer operating from rulership over creation. And they were susceptible now to the powers of darkness because they no longer was in light. Okay? And so every seed reproduces itself. And that means from Adam and Eve and every reproduction afterwards, out of the loins of Adam and Eve came those who were under darkness, the power of darkness. They were born not in the presence of God. Okay? In fact, they were dead to God. They were no longer walking in godly life, benefits, privileges, rights. All right? This is what we call falling from grace. And here they are, walking around, living, growing, doing things, producing, but only producing their kind. And their kind now was children who were under the power of darkness, under the power of sin and death. They allowed death to come alive towards them. So death existed, but it didn't have any power. Okay? And so they now gave power to death. And so that's what God meant when he said, you would surely die. Okay?